Okay, once again, I forgot to go over the note sheets from the previous lesson with you, so we'll go ahead and take care of that right now. If you want to grab Lecture 3 note sheet, and I'll make sure you have the correct responses. Number one, to the Soviets, Operation Barbarossa was known as the Great Patriotic War. Number two, the Russian reaction to the spreading German influence in the Balkans was to sign a treaty with Yugoslavia. Number three, on paper, Führer Directive Number 21 laid out the initial plan for Operation Barbarossa. Number four, rather than tactical military objectives, Hitler's reason for Barbarossa was purely ideological. Number five, expanding German living space, as outlined in Mein Kampf, is called Lebensraum, Lebensraum, Lebensraum. Number six, Hitler chose June the 22nd, 1941, as the date to invade the Soviet Union because Napoleon did the same thing in the year 1812. Number seven, among other reasons, Operation Barbarossa was a major turning point in World War II because it introduced wholesale genocide. Number eight, one of the faulty German assumptions prior to Barbarossa was that the Russian soldier was racially inferior, a word the Germans used called Untermenschen, racially inferior, or also translated as subhuman. Number nine, Vladimir Lenin founded Bolshevism. 10, General Heinz Guderian advocated a deep, penetrating panzer strike straight into the heart of Moscow. Number 11, Heinrich Himmler was appointed the task of overseeing the extermination of the Jews. 12, at Baba Yar in Kiev, over 34,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days. Number 13, Einsatzgruppen were the forces that went behind the invading panzers and infantry to kill Jews. Number 14, Reinhard Heydrich created the iron brooms of the Nazis. Number 15, Adolf Eichmann developed the railway system of mass transportation to Jews to the death camps. 16, Theodor Eicher developed the concentration camp system. 17, at the Wannsee Conference, WANSEE, Heydrich outlined plans for the final solution involving 11 million Jews. 18, the Finns called the opportunity to assist Germany during Barbarossa the Continuation War. Number 19, the wide open vast Russian steppe, STEPPE, provided ideal terrain for the German blitzkrieg tactics. 20, the siege of Leningrad lasted 862 days. 21, on October the 2nd, 1941, Hitler launches Operation Typhoon. 22, tactically, the attack on Moscow was unsound because of the time of the year, the amount of German losses, and the lack of supplies. 23, arguably the greatest single foe the Germans faced during Barbarossa was the Russian winter. 24, on December the 11th, 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States. And 25, 3 German army groups were involved in Barbarossa. So there's the answers to Lecture 3 note sheet. We are going to talk now. We're in Module 4, and we will spend at least one video, perhaps two, on the Asia-Pacific War. The Asia-Pacific War. And so if you're following along with me with your PowerPoint slides, we'll be on slide number 2, starting off. And so tonight we're going to shift focus from we're going to focus rather on the PTO, the Pacific Theater of Operations. When Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, Hawaii, on December the 7th, 1941, they effectively changed the war in Europe into a truly global conflict. And there were many motivators for the Japanese to attack the United States, but we're going to begin by looking back a little bit in time at the 1930s and the road that led to Pearl Harbor and Japan's ascendancy in the PTO, the Pacific Theater of Operations. It's important to realize that Germany's main motivator for war in Europe was ideology. Hitler believed, as we've discussed, that the Jews and the communists were responsible for Germany's defeat in the Great War. Japan, however, was motivated not from ideology, but out of necessity, total necessity. They needed to expand their holdings to gain raw materials. You have to remember, of course, Japan's an island nation. And so Japan was purely about imperialism, imperialistic goals. Now, next slide. A major event happened in the 19th century in Japan that transformed the Japanese samurai culture, the structure, if you will, from a feudal society to one having a market economy that was heavily influenced by the West. And of course, that event was the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji, or Meiji, however you pronounce it, Restoration of 1868. Japan accelerated during this restoration. They accelerated their industrialization, which led to their rise as a true game changer, a true military power by 1905. In fact, they showed the world this when they defeated the Russians during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And that solidified Japan's role, reputation, if you will, as a major colonial power. And like other colonial or imperialistic nations, Japan needed to expand. Next slide. Now, part of the buildup towards war in the Pacific concerned various plans and policies that had been put in place in the early part of the 20th century. As early as 1904, the U.S. Joint Army-Navy Board approved a series of color designations for various nations of the world. Now, don't confuse these with the colors that the Germans used to color code their operations. Two totally different things. But the one that we want to remember most is called War Plan Orange. War Plan Orange, which formed the basis of American strategy in the Pacific, which was in the Pacific. And this War Plan Orange was one of the oldest and most elaborately developed American color-coded war plans developed in the early 20th century, with each color representing a potentially hostile country, a nation that America might see itself going to war against. For example, War Plan Black had to do with Germany. War Plan Green had to do with Mexico, etc. And War Plan Orange had its genesis in America's open door policy way back when that was developed in China, as well as America's acquisition of the Philippines and Hawaii in the late 1890s. And of course, that created the possibility of military competition between the United States, which was color-coded blue, and Japan, which was color-coded orange in the Asia and the Pacific theaters. Next slide. So the color code orange was assigned to Japan, and in 1906, the United States arrived at War Plan Orange. Throughout the coming years, Plan Orange would run through several iterations, but the basic premise of War Plan Orange was the recognition that Japan could be defeated by simply taking advantage of geography. Like England, Japan is an island nation, dependent upon others for its raw materials and resources. So placing a naval blockade around the Japanese islands would prevent men and materiel from moving in and out of the Japanese mainland, rendering Japan incapable of waging any type of an offensive war. And like the Western Allies, Japan also recognized its own limitations, and to counter American influence, Japan determined to build a navy capable of defeating the American Navy, or at least rivaling it on equal terms. And this is something that Great Britain did and they were known in the 19th century for having the world's greatest, most powerful navy. And the motivator for Great Britain doing that in the 19th century, and even really the 18th century, was because they are an island nation. So after the Great War, the League of Nations gave some of the former German possessions in the Central Pacific, those were handed over to Japan. And some of these would have been the Marianas Islands, the Caroline Islands, the Marshall Islands. All this went to Japan as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And this decision by the League of Nations greatly transformed the strategic situation in the Western and Central Pacific. And in keeping with their goal of Western and Southern expansion, the Japanese began to build military bases and airfields on these island possessions that they had recently gained from Germany. In 1920, Japan formulated a basic strategic concept for war against the United States, because as early as the 1920s, they saw that as a real possibility. And this concept involved the following principles. First, control of the sea in Asia in order to secure trade between the Asian mainland and the southern resources areas, places like New Guinea and Australia, etc. Number two, the invasion of Guam would be something they would have to accomplish. Three, they would also have to invade the Philippines. And four, they would need to station a fleet off the coast of southern Japan. In 1924, the United States modified War Plan Orange with the goal of establishing naval superiority in the Western Pacific. However, it wasn't until Hitler attacked Western Europe in May of 1940, of course known as Operation Fall Gelb or Case Yellow, that this modification became a reality with the moving of the Pacific Fleet from San Diego, California to Hawaii. And that, of course, happened in May of 1940. By 1931, Japan felt strong enough to begin its goal of expansion, and Manchuria became the first target. Japan also began formulating its own plan for the eventual clash with the United States. In 1935, Plan Orange again was revised and called this time for a thrust across the Central Pacific through the Marshall Islands to Truk Island, where the U.S. Navy could establish its main fleet for war with Japan. That same year, 1935, the Tydings-McDuffie Act granted independence to the Philippines, which would start in 1946. In the meantime, Philippine President Manuel Quezon asked that General Douglas MacArthur, who was now at that time U.S. Army Chief of Staff and known for his time of service during the Great War, asked that he return to the Philippines and be their advisor. And so MacArthur accepted, chose Dwight Eisenhower as his chief of staff, and the two of them, Eisenhower and MacArthur, returned to the Philippines, and MacArthur was the overall military advisor to all U.S. and Filipino forces. He would retire 2 years later from the Army, yet remained in the Philippines as President Quezon's military advisor. In 1937, Japan invaded China, and this is known as the China Incident, also called the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan enjoyed a string of military success on the Asian mainland, particularly in China and Manchuria. Next slide. In August of 1940, the Japanese Prime Minister introduced an imperialistic propaganda concept that aimed to create cultural and economic unity amidst Northeast Asians, Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders, etc. And this plan, this goal, was known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. I know it's a mouthful. And its main goal was to free all of Asia from European colonial powers. In reality, the Japanese used this policy as a euphemism for controlling countries that would best benefit Japan. Also, in August of 1940, Japan had a navy that was very much stronger than the United States Pacific Fleet. A lot of people don't realize that, and they just assume that the United States was the king when it came to the Navy in the early part of the war, but that's not the case. The Japanese Navy was supreme. And that had a lot to do with them launching two super battleships. These battleships were the Yamato and the Musashi. The Yamato and the Musashi. And these two super battleships gave Japan the edge when it came to a fleet. And it made them the largest and most heavily, these two warships, they were the largest and most heavily armed warships on the planet at that time. That same year, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Naval Expansion Act, which gave the United States Navy the go-ahead to build a two-ocean Navy, which increased the Navy's warship fleet by about 11%. However, Japan felt threatened by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because Japan assumed Stalin might turn his attention on them since Molotov and Ribbentrop had signed that pact. And so if Stalin's attentions wouldn't be focused on Germany, and they wouldn't because of the pact, Japan worried that Stalin might turn his attention on Japan. After all, Japan and Russia had gone to war in 1905. But while Japan may have felt threatened by Russia, the collapse of France in 1940 and the weakness of the Allies, the phony war, during that brief moment of time at that time, that only served to embolden the Japanese to increase their territorial expansion even further, as in away from mainland Asia and into Southeast Asia and territories of the East Indies. Japan had her eyes on Thailand and Burma, Malaya, French Indonesia, and the Dutch East Indies. And if Japan controlled these resource-rich areas, territories below China, she could effectively block Western access to China, which would hurt American and Chinese trade. In September of 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, and they signed it with two other nations, Germany and Italy, effectively creating the Axis powers as we know them from the Second World War. And that pledged full military support should one of those three signatory nations become involved with a country not yet at war. And so this Tripartite Pact, it transformed Germany, Italy, Japan into what we know as the Axis powers. To Japan, their expansionist goals were not really that unrealistic. Taking French Indochina, what we call Vietnam today, would be easy because they felt that it was guarded by just an isolated garrison of Vichy troops. Since Britain had her hands full in Europe, Malaya and Burma were also weakly guarded. And really the only Western power able to do anything about a Japanese advance into the East Indies was the United States. And Japanese strategists assumed that since the United States had not come to France's aid in 1940, then the United States wouldn't come to the aid of Southeast Asia and the East Indies. And so from 1940 to late 1941, the tension between the United States and Japan began to escalate. Next slide. And seeing this, U.S. military leaders agreed that the United States might soon be involved simultaneously in a war with the Axis powers. Therefore, a series of 5 plans labeled Rainbow evolved as a result. Each Rainbow plan included Plan Orange, but Rainbow number 5 gave first priority of American military action to the defeat of Germany and Italy. The preceding 4 plans were voided, and Rainbow 5, or the Germany First plan, took center stage, took priority. In January of 1941, U.S. Ambassador to Tokyo, a man by the name of Joseph Grew, Grew, discovered that the Japanese were planning a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in the event that trouble erupted between the two nations. 2 months before Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Japan signed a neutrality pact with Russia. And diplomatically, this of course cleared the way for the Japanese to move south. And in July of 1941, America decided to freeze all Japanese assets because of their occupation of French Indochina and their expansionist goals in China. President Roosevelt recalled MacArthur from retirement and appointed the Great War veteran as commander of the Philippine Armed Forces and all American troops stationed there. I already mentioned that. Next slide. In October of 1941, Japan decided to realign her military cabinet, and the staunchly militant Hideki Tojo became prime minister. Tojo was Japan's strongest advocate for war and would not entertain the prospect of withdrawing from China, despite U.S. advising him to do so. And while America hoped the Japanese would respond to diplomatic measures, the Japanese had already begun preparing for war with the United States. And in part of doing that, they selected the highly respected Japanese admiral, a man by the name of Isoroku Yamamoto. He was tasked with orchestrating the attack on the United States fleet. Next slide. In late November 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers loaded with 400 planes, accompanied by 9 destroyers, 1 light cruiser, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 3 submarines, all sailed for Hawaii under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. On December the 2nd, 1941, Admiral Nagumo stood on the deck of the carrier that he was sailing on, opened up a sealed envelope that had sealed orders in it that he had not seen yet, and simply read 3 words: climb Mount Nataka. Climb Mount Nataka. This was the code word for the attack on Pearl Harbor. In other words, it was signaling to Admiral Nagumo that they were to proceed, that the attack was a go. Next slide. Of course, the Americans were completely unprepared for this. This attack occurred at about 7:59 Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. 8 U.S. battleships were lined up in a nice little row, as well as all the American aircraft stationed in Oahu was all on the tarmac with their wings touching each other, neatly parked. Providentially, however, 3 of the main United States aircraft carriers were out to sea that day: the Lexington, the Saratoga, and the Enterprise. Next slide. Now, there's been a lot of debate over the years regarding the question of, did the United States know in advance that the attack on Pearl Harbor was going to happen? I've heard all kinds of conspiracy theory arguments. Some people say President Roosevelt knew the attack was going to happen and let it happen because he wanted to get America out of the Great Depression and get us into the war. We'll probably never know for sure. But I want you to consider some of the following events that happened in late 1941. Well, we've talked about some of these already, but it's good to review them. In October, Tojo replaced Prince Kanoe as Japan's prime minister. In November of 1941, Chief of Staff of the Army, General Marshall, U.S. Army, warned General MacArthur that hostile action from the Japanese was imminent. On December the 2nd, Intelligence Chief Edwin Layton informed Commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband Kimmel, that the location of 4 Japanese carriers was now suddenly unknown. Couldn't find them. On December the 3rd, U.S. Navy Admiral Stark sent a dispatch to Admiral Kimmel that Japanese diplomats had been ordered to destroy their codes. On December 6th, 13 parts of a 14-paragraph message from Tokyo was decrypted and delivered to President Roosevelt. Now, this showed that Japan, this coded message that had been decrypted, it showed that Japan intended to break off diplomatic relations. So Roosevelt now knew Japan was going to attack, but he did not know where. When the 14th part of the 14th paragraph of that message finally reached Secretary of State Hall at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which happens to be 7 a.m. Hawaii time on December the 7th, it confirmed that the Japanese were going to attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet at dawn on December the 7th at Pearl Harbor. However, poor weather conditions prevented the cable from reaching Pearl Harbor until the attack was already underway, so there was really no way to warn them. As Japanese fighters, torpedo bombers, and high-level bombers loomed over Oahu, nobody realized that the attack was happening. They didn't realize that it was an attack. Radar operators on Oahu wrongly assumed that the little blips they saw on the radar screen were actually a squadron of American bombers coming from the West Coast. While 2,403 Americans died, Churchill's first thought when he heard about the attack was this: we have won the war. We have won the war. Finally, America was all in. Next slide. These are some pictures that I took from the Arizona Memorial a few years ago. My family and I had the privilege to take a week or two vacation on Oahu, and of course I had to see Pearl Harbor. And so I took some snapshots. Next slide. A few thoughts about Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, for one, was not the great victory that Japan had hoped for, because they failed to destroy American submarines. They failed to destroy any of our carriers. The attack left the infrastructure of Pearl Harbor still intact. And most importantly, it united Americans for the war effort. Next slide. To most Americans, the strike on Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning in December was the only thing the Japanese accomplished that last month of 1941. But nothing could be further from the truth. They, in fact, launched simultaneous offensives to accomplish all their objectives. And the first stage was to take the Southern Resources area, the British, the French, the Dutch colonies of Southeast Asia. By the end of December 1941, the Japanese controlled the Philippines, Siam, or Taiwan now, Malaya, Guam, Wake Island, and even Hong Kong, and assorted other islands in the Southwest Pacific. Plus, they enjoyed total air superiority and sea superiority in Southeast Asia. Next slide. The next thing they did was they targeted the Gilbert Island chain in the Western Pacific. They also managed to push the British out of Hong Kong, and they sank the British capital. They sank the two British battleships, the HMS Repulse and the HMS Prince of Wales, and these were the two first capital ships ever sunk by aircraft alone. By March of 1942, the entire United States Asiatic Fleet was gone, and Japan controlled Singapore, Burma, Malaya. The only remaining obstacle for Pacific domination for the Japanese remained the Philippine Islands. Next slide. Although MacArthur had around 13,000 troops on the Philippines, the American government had pretty much written off the defending or helping MacArthur because of the Rainbow First, the Rainbow Five Germany First policy. Only 10 hours after hitting Pearl Harbor, the Japanese decided to invade the Philippines in what has been called Little Pearl Harbor. After wiping out over 100 American planes, the Japanese began landing troops on the northern island of Luzon. As more and more enemy troops landed both at Luzon and the Lingayen Gulf, MacArthur ordered the Filipino and American forces to retreat into the Bataan Peninsula as part of the Rainbow Five directives. The U.S. Navy tried desperately to assist, but it was in vain, and the battle for Bataan ended up in a 3-month siege with Americans and Filipinos starving to death, and on March the 12th, 1942, MacArthur was ordered off the island along with his family and support staff. And while he promised to return, many American and Filipino troops felt that he had deserted them in their hour of need to save his own skin. On April the 8th, the Japanese smashed the weakened American and Filipino lines, and U.S. Army Major General Edward P. King surrendered to the Japanese. And what followed was one of the most horrific examples of brutality in military history or world history. And of course, I'm speaking of the famous Bataan Death March. The Bataan Death March. Next slide. There were two reasons for the Death March. First, the Japanese didn't expect to take so many men prisoner, and they didn't know what to do with them all. How were they going to feed them? How were they going to give them water, and so forth? And number two, the warrior code that the Japanese lived by, something known as Bushido, meant that any soldier, in their eyes, who surrendered was unworthy of respect or even unworthy of being treated as a human being. Next slide. Along the death march to Camp O'Donnell, which is where the Japanese were taking their prisoners, along this death march, some 7,600 men perished. Many from starvation, disease, the brutality of the Japanese. In fact, one particularly gruesome anecdote I'll share with you, method of killing American and Filipino captives as they marched to this camp was to load up a Japanese truck with soldiers who would then stick their bayonets, out the side of the truck, and as the driver sped by and accelerated, hundreds of throats would be slit. Some men even decapitated as they walked along in misery, starving to death, captive. Of course, this goes against any kind of civilized warfare, goes against the Hague or Geneva Convention, but the Japanese didn't abide by those conventions during the Second World War. And because of these brutalities, Life magazine, a very popular periodical in the United States at that time, Life magazine ran an article letting the world know of these atrocities. And when the American public found out about this, they were enraged. And U.S. Marines would make the Japanese pay when it came time during the island hopping campaigns. I'm going to go ahead and stop this video right here, and we'll pick it up with slide number 20, and we'll talk about the island of Corregidor.